everyone, welcome to another Classic Movie Monday, and today I thought it would be interesting to briefly address an animated film this time around, in particular an animated film series that I think really does hold up and really I think expresses something that was I think unique to animation as a whole. And I briefly did touch on this series in particular when I was talking about my favorite trilogies, but I thought I would go a little bit more in depth today and kind of give you some background into the Toy Story series, or basically the Toy Story, the series, meaning 1, 2, and 3. So without further ado, let me address some of the interesting things that I think are important to note when it comes to Toy Story. This was the first ever computer-generated animated film that was made. So it did have a huge influence as to what ultimately becomes of animation as we see animation now. Because usually animated films were drawn in 2D, meaning just pen and paper. But now, pencil, but now this technology allowed animated filmmaking to be transformed, so to speak. And largely it's owed to Toy Story, the first film. And I find that to be so fascinating because it had such a huge impact on the industry, because just short times afterwards we see multiple upon multiple films, not just within Disney Pixar's lineup, but also DreamWorks adopting this idea. And largely it started because of Toy Story, similar to how Snow White launched the animated film. But what I really enjoy about Toy Story is that it sort of reflects onto childhood imagination and childhood experience. Its stories and its characters seem to showcase a kind of childlike way of looking at the world. You know, everything is so big, it's so much more complicated than the way an adult would see it. And that's largely how sort of the toys view the world that they end up having to explore and sort of go on an adventure on. I also find it really fascinating how the toys in particular in the series are very devoted to their owner, and how much of a necessity the owner is to them, because the owner sort of gives the toys purpose and meaning. Sort of in a way I think children see sort of playtime as a means of, you know, sort of fitting in, sort of you know, socializing. You know, toys see the child as someone that they devote their time to. So again, it's one of those things where it kind of just reflects onto this interesting reality that's that sort of shapes childhood, while at the same time, you know, creating something that's purely fictionalized. But basically, in case you are unaware of what Toy Story is about, basically it revolves around a variety of toys, but in particular the main characters throughout the series are Woody and Buzz. They take up the majority of the screen time, and they take up the most time when it comes to, I would say, character development. And they're owned by this kid named Andy. And you see how eventually throughout the series Andy sort of grows up, so to speak. and you see how they sort of going through different stages. Um, and I think that's oftentimes how we sort of, you know, um, end up perceiving childhood, because, we kind of grow up and, we're forced to, take on responsibility. Um, and in doing so, we sort of lose the connections we once had that were sort of a part of our childhood. Um, and how eventually, time just goes on, and we end up developing, new experiences, and we transition into sort of adulthood. And that's kind of what the Toy Story series sort of culminates to. It's not just the childhood experience, but it's also the growth away from the childhood experience. And you'll see how that affects the toys as you watch the series of films. But what I find also very fascinating about the Toy Story series is that it kind of came out at a very sort of appropriate time. And what I mean by that is as a kid within the 90s, the series kind of grew with you, because, as the second one came out, it was kind of around the time when you were still a kid. And then the third one, where everything's supposed to sort of conclude, and the characters are a lot older, or, well, in particular, the owner, Andy, is a lot older. It sort of knew how to grow the series, so to speak. It was like, you had this group of kids that knew the first Toy Story, and then now they're sort of going back and revisiting that experience all the way up to the ending of the series within the third film. So it really knew how to capture that audience. And I guess you could consider me as part of that audience. But I think the concept of toys coming to life wasn't a new thing per se, but I think the way in which Toy Story executed that concept was also something that is, I think, noteworthy and is a lot different than what we've seen before. Usually when toys come to life, they're not given this much of in-depth personality, and they're not given this much of story. A lot of the times, as far as what I've seen in regards to animations, usually toys are they're kind of just there, sort of in the background. I guess you could consider the Lego Movie another film that sort of captures toys. But although you could argue that the whole plot from the Lego Movie is just based within a child's mind, whereas here they clearly try to showcase that the toys sort of have their own sort of um, ability to talk and do whatever. And I think this was sort of I think maybe it might have been too, like, sort of radical concept that, I mean, it would, I think, freak legitimately anybody out, even a kid, the fact that toys were alive. But again, we didn't see it to the extent that I think Toy Story gave this kind of a concept. Most of the time, it was just either the toys were kind of in the background. When they would come to life, they would come to life in a certain way, and they were showcased in various shorts and things like that, but they weren't. A film wasn't really devoted to them, and again, not a whole lot of the toys really talked, at least from what I can remember, or had really really distinct character, because I mean they weren't really given that much dialogue. As far as what I could tell from in the past. So I think when people saw Toy Story, I could totally understand why they felt that this was something different, this was something new and interesting, and that's why I find this series to be one of the more memorable trilogy series. And it's just an interesting concept, and how they executed that concept, I think, is one that is worth noting. Um, Especially considering the fact that, you know, the animation is still stellar for its time. Again, is it's a little bit computery? Yeah, and will I always prefer 2D animation? Yes. Um, but when you look at this film and you look at films like Snow White that came out and had their um, really nicely colored animation with its various artistic backgrounds and such, you sort of see that artistry displayed within Toy Story with the amount of depth they try to give the characters' faces at times, you know, and how they try to make them look fairly realistic. There are points where it looks, again, a little goofy. Again, there are probably similar or, you know, different, but also little mistakes that Snow White did too. But overall, as a whole, Toy Story, I think, captured what a lot of kids were kind of searching for, because I think a lot of kids probably wanted to see this concept come to life, because a lot of the times, a lot of childhood is shaped through toys and through interactions with things that may not be alive. Largely because, you know, kids are kind of trying to find themselves. Um, and oftentimes toys would kind of give children their identity. I mean, you can just look at the way, you know, the way girls play and how they're shaping their identity, and you can see how boys are playing and how they sort of shape their identity. You know, it's all based on these non-living things, but they reflect onto something that's very profound and real. Um, and I think that's what a lot of kids liked about Toy Story. They liked the idea of toys being given this kind of a voice, because um, you know, they kids are probably the only ones who believe that, you know, toys sort of have a voice, so to speak, or that toys play a role in. You know, I mean, toys don't really play a role for adults, but they do for children. So I think that's something that's just very interesting to note, and it's one I think is that I think is uh, that I think just really shows you the amount of I think weight a lot of people really give this film. Is it perfect? Is it a perfect series? Absolutely not. Nothing is perfect. Did the animation get better over time? Yeah, sure. That's definitely a given. Did did the stories maybe get a little bit better? Yeah, I feel like that the stories were a little bit more, um, a little bit more higher staked than in the first film. Whereas the first film was more of like kind of like an introduction, while at the same time having, you know, some kind of plot. But you don't feel the weight of all of the toys um, in the same way, I think, than you do in the second and the third film. But again, the first film serves its purpose. So again, it works as a trilogy, and it also works as just films on their own. And again, you kind of don't really need to watch them all in order to really get what they're saying. But at the same time, it's just nice to see the characters um, in a sequence like it is actually showcased. So, you know, it just depends on what kind of a viewer you are. Um, but overall, I think the and again, the reason it's not just the fact that it was the first computer animated film. It was because the film did a stellar job for what it ultimately showcased. Similar to Snow White, I don't give it credit just because it was the first uh, animated film. I give it credit because it actually stood its time over the years. And I think Toy Story will come to be one of those same series of animated films to do that. But I think that's really ultimately all I can say when it comes to Toy Story. But again, if there are any questions, comments, concerns, I'd be more than happy to answer them. Thank you so much for watching. Hope you all have a pleasant day, week, month, and year. And I hope to see you on the next video. Take care. Bye-bye.